Hello and welcome. My name is Happy Ferrarin, and this is Raptor Talk. Earlier this month, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, or the IPCC, released a report that outlines the catastrophic effects of climate change. But what does this mean in the Philippine context? For us to understand what this looks like in our communities and in our country, we talked to some experts in the community show Courage On. Let's watch the interview.
So if the IPCC report says that magkakaroon ng shift ng 1.5 degrees Celsius sa temperatura ng buong mundo, ano bang ibig sabihin nun para sa Pilipinas? So with us today, we have the country director of Greenpeace Philippines, Leah Guerrero.
Good afternoon.
Hello, Leah. Welcome. We also have the National Coordinator of Kalikasan People's Network for the Environment, Leon Dulce, with us. Welcome, Leon. And we have Dr. Jorge Emanuel, member of the science team of the No to 174 Dumaguete Islands Coalition. So, welcome, Leia, Leon, and Jorge to our show. Like what I said, medyo overwhelming itong report, diba? Thousands of pages ng data and predictions, ano bang mangyayari. So let's start with the big picture. What does it mean for the Philippines? How does the Philippines, what does it mean? This 1.5 degrees Celsius change in the temperature. Anong mangyayari, in other words, sa Philippines? So we can start with you, Leah.
Happy, siguro balikan ko yung sinabi mo kanina na yung sinabi mo na magkakaroon ng change in temperature ng 1.5. Actually, yung report, ang sinasabi niya ay kailangan natin i-limit yung change sa temperature within 1.5. So, hindi niya sinasabi na magkakaroon ng ganon. Sinasabi niya na ina-affirm niya yung isang previous report din ng IPCC na kailangan natin na malimit ang global temperatures to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. So, yung report na to, actually, ang sinasabi niya is things that we already know. Pero ang ginagawa niya, binibigyan niya ito ng further detail. Mas may details, depth, tsaka certainty. Yung mga sinasabi niya na yung climate ay nagbabago at dahil sa human activity, sinabi niya na it is with certainty na nagyayari yan dahil sa human activity. Tapos kapag nadagdagan pa ang carbon na nasa atmosphere, lalala yung situation. Ang pinaka-importante na takeaway na makukuha natin dito ay yung importance pa rin of staying within the Paris Agreement na yung goal to stay within 1.5 degrees centigrade. It would mean that there will be less of all those impacts. So less sea level rise, worsening weather extremes, etc. Nakikita na natin na nagyayari ang mga weather extremes ngayon. Pero if we keep within 1.5 degrees Celsius and don't go beyond that, mas protektado, siguro, mas secure tayo kaysa kapag lumagpas siya ng 1.5. So, ang sinasabi to ng report din, hindi nakita natin yung mga headlines sa kanya, 'di ba? Code red, parang alarm na talaga. And totoo 'yun. Matagal na nag-a-alarm ang mga NGO, civil society na kailangan kilusan na talaga yung pag-action sa climate. Ang sinasabi ng report na ito na reachable pa rin, na pwede tayong mag-stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius, but we need rapid emissions cuts. Specifically, we need to have carbon emissions by 2030. In 8 years, kailangan kalahati na lang yung carbon emissions na pinoproduce ng mundo, and then bring it down to zero by 2050. And with that scenario, makukuha natin to stay within the 1.5 limit. Siguro isa rin na importante na point ng report na ito ay aside from there is hope, there is a way to keep this within the limit na hindi madidisgrasya ang karamihan ng mga tao. Ang isa pang importanteng point na makukuha natin from the report is yung importance ng preparedness, risk management, dealing with yung adaptation, loss and damage. Kailangan nagprepare na talaga yung mga gobyerno ngayon para matulungan nila na mag-cope yung mga tao to prepare for these climate impacts.
Okay. Thank you, Leah. Thank you also for that clarification. So I'm glad that you think that there is hope that we will, stay within that limit of the 1.5 degrees. Leon, for you naman, Leon, I want to ask you, kasi syempre you see what's happening on the ground. What does it mean for the Philippines? Nabanggit yung government preparedness or us, the citizens, how will we prepare for these things that are inevitable na mangyayari dahil nga sa climate crisis natin. What are you seeing on the ground? Are we prepared? Are there changes are you seeing changes happening?
Una sa lahat, magandang makita na it's not only the projections in the future that we have to address or prepare with. Yung effects ng climate change na naranasan natin ngayon eh. So, kunyari dun sa ang tingin kong isang bago doon sa report ay mas tumaas na yung certainty ng mga scientists sa ilang mga nararanasan natin na ngayon. Kunyari yung pinakatiyak na nakadugtong sa climate change ay yung nararanasan na natin ngayon na matitinding heat extremes o yung tag-init na nararanasan natin. Ito ay unequivocally nakadugtong na doon sa human-induced climate change. To a certain degree of certainty din ay yung nararanasan nating malalaking mga buhos ng ulan, yung mataas na rainfall precipitation, nakadugtong na rin yan sa anthropogenic climate change. And for other factors as well, yung pagtaas ng sea level, nakadugtong na rin yan. No? Since the start of the industrial period yata hanggang 2018, kung di ako nagkakamali, tumaas na ng 0.20 meters yung sea level on average sa buong mundo. Tapos ang sinasabi nga, if business as usual ang magpatuloy, mas dodoble, triple pa yung maranasan natin na dami ng ulan, tag-init, yung sinasabing tagtuyot na hindi yung natural cycles, at yung pagtaas ng karagatan natin and therefore coastal flooding. So I think magandang idiin nga na handa na ba tayo sa nangyayari ngayon at yung lalong papatinding senaryo sa susunod na mga dekada, no? Tingin ko nahihirapan na nga tayong mag-grasp lalo sa panahon ng pandemya. Nakikita nyo, kulang na kulang yung serbisyong na ibibigay, yung response na ibibigay ng gobyerno sa pandemya. Lalo pa noong nakaraang taon na naranasan na natin yung konkretong mukha ng climate change. Nung tumama ng matindi sa atin yung Typhoon Ulysses, and then yung nakaraang mga buwan noong nagkaroon tayo ng matitinding sunod-sunod na ulan mula sa habagat. Ito na po yung manifestation noon, no, na nararanasan na talaga natin. It will worsen in the next decades to come, no. So ito ba ay na-anticipate ng gobyerno? Ito ba ay nalalaanan ng sapat na pondo na hindi lang tayo nagre-react doon sa mga impacts na ito? Bagkus naglalaan ba tayo ng sapat na subsidyo para ma-anticipate kung ano na yung mga long-term effects na pinoproject dito sa latest iteration ng IPCC report? Yun yung mga dapat nating tanungin, at sa tingin ko, lalo ngayon na budget season na sa Kongreso, masisilip natin, hindi talaga nakakapaglaan ng sapat na budget for proactive climate action, no? Kaya kunyari yung nabanggit na paghandaan yung bagyo, yung baha, at ang tawag dito, yung tagtuyot, nakikita ba natin kung sumasapat ba yung protection crucial dyan, yung mga watershed areas natin, yung mga forested areas sa upstream, yung pagpaplano ng ating urban development na kumakain doon sa mga natural na floodplains, nagagawa ba natin yan? Na napipigilan ba natin yung construction ng mga infrastructure sa tabing dagat, sa coastal areas? Kasi magiging catchment yan ng baha, hindi lang galing sa taas ng upstream ng watershed, kundi yung galing din sa dagat mismo dahil sa sea level rise. So marami tayong kailangang paghandaan. I doubt na pag-uusapan at nalalaanan ng sapat na aksyon, and therefore mas crucial talaga ngayon yung ingay natin na kailangan na natin ng pagkilos para dito.
Right. Salamat, Leon. You mentioned about thinking about sustainable infrastructure. How are we building for the future in a sustainable way? So I think that's what No to 174 Dumaguete is all about. And Dr. Jorge, I want to hear your thoughts. Syempre, alam namin maraming taong opposed sa pinaplanong smart city ng dun sa Dumaguete. Can you tell us more about the experience there? Kasi syempre, you're there, you know what it's like. What's happening with the movement to stop this reclamation project?
This was something that many of us didn't even know anything about till about July 14. Na it turned out that where all these negotiations taking place that the public did not know about, and all of a sudden we were told that the mayor was asking the city council for authority to come into an agreement with a Filipino firm to create two major islands, 174 hectares, which will cover about 80-85% of the coast of Dumaguete. Within 24 hours, more than 100 people signed a petition against it. And since then, we've had the three major universities in our area, Silliman University, St. Paul University, Dumaguete, and the president of Foundation University come out against it. We've had the Catholic Diocese come out against it. We had organizations of architects, youth and students, and we had the basic sectors, organizations of pedicab drivers, of ambulant vendors, of the urban poor also come out against it. No? So it was very broad, a very broad response to what happened. And people opposed it for multiple reasons. No? Some opposed it because there was no transparency, there was no public consultation, and this was just foisted on the community without the knowledge of the general population. There were legal questions that were raised, but many also opposed it because of environmental reasons. Can you imagine that we are going to bury corals, seagrass beds, up to 174 hectares of this area, and it's going to affect somewhere of the order of about 100 hectares, I believe, of corals and 70 hectares and damage 70 hectares of seabed grass. And keep in mind, no, that when you do a reclamation like this, it's not just the area that you're burying, but it's also the effect of creating these islands, no? Because when you create these artificial islands, they create siltation and a sediment plume, which then affects our mangroves, then affects way beyond our reclamation. It affects even our terrestrial ecosystems because of the quarrying that will be needed for all the rocks. And I have studied the Chinese method of making these artificial islands. And that's important because we later found out that the Filipino company, EM Cuerpo, had an agreement with the Chinese state-owned company called Polychanda, a subsidiary of China Poly Group, that will actually do the reclamation and island building. And when I looked at how China has done these reclamations in other countries and in the West Philippine Sea, we can see that these sediment plumes can extend 20 to even 40 kilometers away from the island that's being created. And so I actually computed that in addition to 174 hectares that will be buried, it's going to have, there'll be an area of, I estimated about 1,900 hectares of seabed that will be destroyed to get the sand using these, they're called trailer suction hopper dredgers that are like vacuum cleaners that will suck the sediment to create the islands that will be made. So the devastation will be massive. And so I want to connect this to the issue of climate change. One of the unsung heroes of climate change, of our fight for climate justice, are our seagrass beds and our mangroves. You know that our seagrass beds and our mangroves can absorb carbon dioxide faster than our forests, and for example, our mangroves can absorb 10 times more carbon dioxide from the air and sequester it in the soil, not just in the biomass, and keep it there for hundreds of years. And the same could be said about seagrass beds, which can sequester about 500 tons of carbon dioxide for every hectare of seagrass beds. By destroying this, we are destroying the capability of what I call the gift of nature to us. These rich coastal resources we have that help us fight climate change and help us become more resilient. Because, for example, if you have a 100-meter stretch of mangrove trees, you can decrease the storm surge by about 66%. They are an important resource to protect us from the storm surges. No? So I'm really worried that we're having a lot of reclamation projects around the country. I hear now in Bohol, in Cebu, in Leyte. These are all unsolicited proposals like the one in Dumaguete. And we are destroying some of the most vital resources we have to protect us from climate change. You know, our seagrass beds in the Philippines are second only to Australia in the number of species we have. And our coral reefs, including the ones here in Dumaguete, about 10 of those species are considered edge species, which means they are on the edge of extinction. So we need to protect that for future generations. So that's the reason many of us in Dumaguete have gone together to fight this 174-hectare reclamation project.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Jorge. And you mentioned that actually there are a lot of reclamation projects being proposed. I wonder though, with the rising sea levels, how practical are reclamation projects? Hindi ba matatabunan lang sila ng baha kung nagra-rise din ang mga sea levels? So I don't know
Yes.
if that has an impact.
Yes, actually, it has multiple effects because one effect is in the case of Dumaguete, they're building these two huge islands, um, 30 meters from our shores. And one of the things that's going to do is it's going to alter the natural drainage of our rivers and our creeks out into the sea. And by doing that, it will increase the amount of flooding encroachment in our coastal communities. So it's going to worsen the flooding situation. And at the same time, they will be, in a way, like a buffer on the other hand. But then you're creating these islands that at some point portions of it may well be underwater. One of the things that the IPCC report points out is that, especially in Southeast Asia and in the Philippines in particular, at least from other studies, the sea level rise will be quite serious for us. And so I have looked at there was another recent smaller reclamation here in Dumaguete that some of us were opposing, but it went on during COVID, so we weren't able to succeed in trying to stop it. But it did not even take into account the fact that we are going to expect in the next 30 to 50 years much higher sea levels, and so parts of that the existing small reclamation will be underwater. So these are the problems that we are facing.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jorge. I want to go back to the point that Leah made a while ago about preparedness, our capacity of absorbing, and how do we respond to this. Leon talked about it as well. So we know the Philippines is very familiar with the effect of climate change. Diba? Sa Typhoon Yolanda, mag-8 years na tayo this coming November since Yolanda happened. Has anything changed? So from what you've seen, Leah, has anything changed in terms of how we are responding to this from that time? 8 years ago na yung Yolanda. Anong nagbago or meron bang nagbago?
Siguro to be fair, I think meron naman nagbago kasi magmula nung Yolanda, so ang mga local government units, nagpre-prepare na talaga sila. Ang ano lang, siguro yung isang kailangan magyari na nakikita ng Greenpeace ay kailangan natin ng parang mas coherent na climate plan, climate strategy from the country. So there have been improvements in, for example, we've had last year, nung sunod-sunod yung bagyo nung December, nag-declare ng climate emergency declaration yung Congress. Declaration pa lang ito, kailangan maging action. So may mga nagyayari, pero kailangan pa na dagdagan yung nagyari tungkol doon. So From local government units, you'd see that they are more prepared for floods compared to a decade ago, but we can see that this preparedness is not enough. So what needs to be happening is actually more support from the national government in creating a coherent climate strategy that has both yung adaptation, pagiging resilient sa climate crisis, tsaka mitigation, yung reduce din natin ng ating greenhouse gas emissions. Kailangan na buo yung ating strategiya. Nakikita natin na, for now, I'd say that there have been recent developments, like the moratorium on greenfield coal plants that we saw several months ago, the RE law from a decade ago, merong CHR inquiry on fossil fuel companies. Kailangan lahat ito ay malagyan ng plano na buo, kailangan magkaroon ng political will yung ating executive na talagang gawin niya of the state ang climate action. Kumbaga sa panahon ngayon na we're struggling with the pandemic, 'di ba? Binanggit niyo nga sa umpisa ng show na to na parang ang hinaharap natin ay two crises, right? Na talagang malaki yung impact sa society. So kailangan habang nag-craft ng recovery ang gobyerno, ang recovery na ito ay dapat parang climate proofing na rin ng Pilipinas. Ang nakikita natin ay opposite. So balik tayo dun sa binanggit ni Dr. Jorge na tungkol sa reclamation. Yung mga proyekto na nagyayari ngayon ay parang ang angle lang nila ay economic recovery. Yung sabihin nila na, maganda ito, magkakaroon ng smart city, etc. Pero hindi nila nakikita na kailangan ang recovery ay hindi lang tungkol sa pera na makukuha doon sa facility na yon or doon sa structure na yon in the future. Pero kailangan, yung sustainable, yung pagkagawa niya para yung mga buhay ng mga tao ay umigi. So nakikita natin na yung mga reclamation projects, they're being designed as economic as a way to create economic activity, but the downside of it is that it's putting environment ecosystems at risk and therefore people at risk because we depend on the ecosystem for our existence, and that's one of the things that the report and everything that we know about what's happening with the environment right now, that is what it is telling us.
Right. So I think the key is sustainable and long-term in terms of thinking about our solutions. I want to ask Leon about the environmental defenders, because we're talking about preparedness of government, the policies that they're doing. What about on the side of environmental defenders, ordinary citizens? Can you tell us about the challenges that they're facing right now with the climate crisis?
Oo, happy kasi we're emphasizing on the importance of natural ecosystems that we have. Sila yung first and last line of defense natin sa impacts ng climate change. And especially for our green spaces, yung mga watershed forests natin, yung mga coastal green belts natin. These also serve as our major carbon sinks, no, to also contribute to the mitigation of climate change. Pero ang nangyayari ngayon, ang sinasabi ng IPCC report, if we continue on this business as usual na trajectory, even the capacity of these ecosystems to serve as carbon sinks, na babawasan yung efficacy, na babawasan yung kakayahan niya na maglinis ng ating atmosfera. Kaya all the more important na sa panahon na ito, hindi pa in the next 30 years or the next 50 years, mapreserba yung mga fully mature ecosystems na meron tayo, ng mga kagubatan, ng mga bakawan at iba pa. Tapos yung mga tanggol kalikasan natin na lagi yan in the absence of sufficient environmental governance, ang nagtitiyak na napagtatanggol tong mga ekosistemang to, mga ordinaryong mamamayan, tulad ng mga katutubo, ng mga magsasaka, ng mga park rangers natin at iba pa, no? Pero ang Pilipinas, na isa sa mga pinaka-vulnerableng bansa sa climate change, Hindi niya pinangangalagaan yung kalagayan ng mga tanggol kalikasan niya. In fact, we have been consistently the deadliest country in Asia for environmental defenders over the past 4 or 5 years, kung di ako nagkakamali. Tapos, consistently nasa top 3 tayo ng pinaka-nakamamatay na bansa sa buong mundo. Kaya yun, hindi nabibigyan ng pagpapahalaga, bagkus laging nakikriminalize pa, tinatawag na kontra sa development, tinatawag na kontra sa gobyerno, terorista, komunista, yung mga tanggol kalikasan natin ngayon. So, ang pag-atake sa mga environmental defenders will have a multiplier effect doon sa climate crisis natin kasi you are removing our best defense for the environment. You are removing our best solutions, which are the environmental defenders, for achieving climate justice, for achieving climate resilience for our communities. Kaya parang yun yung gustong ko ring makita na sa sinasabi ni Leia na coherent sana yung policy. Kung magkakaroon man sila ng climate plan, ano ang plano nila para sa preservation ng ating mga natural ecosystems, yung mga fully mature ecosystems natin. At ano yung plano nila para dun sa mga nangangalaga nito, yung mga nature's frontliners natin, yung mga environmental defenders.
Right. So thank you for sharing your thoughts about all the. It's very hard to absorb because a very big concept siya. So before we end this segment, I think I want to ask all of you, what do you think people can do then? So this is a show really about how people can take action. So we know that government, yes, there needs to be a sustainable policy around it. But what about for ordinary citizens? How can we, when the pandemic happened, all of us, we knew that we have to do our part by wearing a mask and social distancing. Ano yung equivalent nun for the climate crisis? So what do you think people should do, or what can people do? Especially now that we are in a pandemic, what is the response that people can do to help solve the climate crisis? Dr. Jorge?
Yeah, maybe one thing I would say is people need to educate themselves, understand what this will mean for them, first of all, because we need this understanding to move us. No? So this is the way I think about it. Think of a person who's born today. No? By the time that person gets to be 30 to 50 years old, they'll be living, if things are business as usual and do not change, they will be living in a world wherein to jog for 30 minutes when the wet bulb temperature is at a very high level, high humidity, high temperatures, they could die within 20 minutes, no, because of the extremes of heat and humidity. They will see ecosystem collapses. They will see the extinction of a lot of species. It is not a world that we want for our future generations. So maybe my message to young people, and I'm so happy in the reclamation opposition campaign, I'm meeting so many young people. If you look at what your future is like, if you don't do anything, then I think you need to fight for it. And unfortunately, my generation, the IPCC report is an indictment of my generation and those before me of the lack of stewardship we had over planet Earth. So we need to understand the different campaigns happening, and we need to be part of it, whether it's opposing reclamation, whether it's opposing, for example, the changes to our Clean Air Act that will bring back incineration, which as a waste to energy technology, which has the highest carbon intensity of all forms of energy creation. It produces more both biogenic and fossil fuel carbon than coal-fired plants and fuel-fired plants. And yet there's a move to try to undermine that in our Clean Air Act. There are so many things we can do, but we need to see it in a systemic way, because somewhere in the IPCC report I was reading, but it's just not enough for us to get people to start planting trees. We need to do something in a larger scale. And so I urge them all to read the IPCC reports, especially on the things that we can do to fight for food security, to fight for water sufficiency, for sustainable cities. These are the things that we all need to do.
Thank you, Dr. Jorge. What about you, Leia?
Salamat, Happy. Yeah, agree ako dun sa mga sinabi ni Dr. Jorge. Pero siguro mag-step back ako ng konti. Kasi pag tiningnan natin yung 'di ba, lahat tayo meron tayong pwedeng gawin, meron tayong role para ma-ensure that we are able to take action on the climate crisis. What I'd like to point out is that that responsibility rests on some entities more than on others. So for example, this whole climate crisis that we're facing, ang responsible dito ay mainly fossil fuel companies, right? Tsaka mga industrialized nations. And they have the biggest role to play, the biggest responsibility, the biggest accountability to make sure that climate action is done, to make sure that we stay within the Paris goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So on the part of people in society, who are least responsible, like mga kabataan, nabuhay na sila sa mundo na hindi pa, na nakagisnan na nila na meron ng climate crisis, 'di ba? Hindi nila kasalanan. Ang pinaka magandang gawin nila ito, yung whole point nitong session na ito, courage on, tumindig, makialam, kumilos. Kailangan natin na kumilos, tumindig, at maganda na nagkakaroon ng mga ganito na forum para mas ma-involve natin ang mga kabataan, ang mga iba't ibang sektor, iba't ibang mga tao to understand na we need to be demanding action. We need to be really fighting for our voices to be heard, na kailangan mag-aksyon nito mga may kasalanan sa climate change. Kasi kapag yung sinasabi natin na lifestyle changes, wag tayo mag-drive ng sasakyan, wag gumamit ng plastic, etc. Maganda yon. That's small acts, right? When we do every day, we know that it is something that is leading us to a sustainable lifestyle. But more than that, because the problem is systemic, it's embedded.
Siguro, magkakaroon lang ng ilang technical difficulties, pero dudugtungan ko na yung sinasabi ni Leia, kasi nasa loob ng IPCC report mismo sinasabi na yung mga political, economic, social, and technological decisions na meron ang ating mga bansa, yun yung magiging susi sa pag-enhance ng ating adaptation at pag-promote ng sustainable development, and therefore pag-redress ng crisis. So ano yun pagtukoy talaga na sino ba ang pinaka may kapangyarihan na makapaggawa ng economic, social, technological, and political decisions and actions. Yung ating estado, yung ating gobyerno. Kaya ang panawagan ng mga kabataan ngayon na nagsa-strike laban sa krisis ng klima, di ba, ay system change, not climate change. So ang mga individual kayang maging bahagi ng mas malalaki at mas matatapang, bigger and bolder actions, no? At yun na tingin ko yung hamon ngayon sa lahat, na go out and join a climate striker group, go out and join an environmental action group, maging bahagi ng mas malaking solusyon na nagsama-samang kumikilos, no, para protektahan yung ating kapaligiran, ipanawagan yung pagbabago sa ating mga patakaran, at lalo ngayon paparating na yung eleksyon, no, tiyakin na ang ating mga leader mula sa lokal hanggang pabansang gobyerno ay mailuklok batay sa platapormang makakalikasan at para sa hustisya ng ating nasisirang klima, no? So maraming political actions na pwedeng gawin ang mamamayan, at yun ay maka-capture nga sa panawagan na tumindig, makialam at kumilos.
Ayun. Thank you, Leon. At salamat. I think nagka-problema ako konti with my internet. So thank you very much to our guests, Leia, Leon, and Dr. Jorge, for giving us more information on how we can take a stand and also care about our environment despite the pandemic that we're facing. And I think it's also about thinking long-term, sustainable, and also accepting accountability on those that really have the largest responsibility, because they have the most power to really affect change when it comes to our climate crisis.
To continue this very important conversation, you can follow Rappler on all your social media platforms. Once again, my name is Happy Ferrarin. This has been Rappler Talk. Good day.